The carriage wheels stopped rolling, but Alexander Whitmore did not move. He sat in the dark, staring at the tall iron gates of his own home, and for a moment he could not make himself believe he was truly there. 18 months of mud, gunfire, and cold nights had changed him more than he wanted to admit. He had written no letters ahead. He wanted no procession, no trumpets, no crowd of servants lined up to greet a man who had once been given up for dead. He wanted only to walk through his own front door and feel, for one quiet moment, that the war was finally behind him. He stepped down from the carriage and told the driver to leave the trunks until morning. The night air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. He walked the gravel path alone, boots crunching softly, and looked up at the house that had raised him. Windows glowed with lamplight. That surprised him. He had expected darkness, dust sheets, silence, the sort of stillness that comes over a house whose master has not been seen in over a year. Instead, the house was alive. He stood at the base of the stone steps and felt something shift uneasily in his stomach. A house does not light itself. A house does not keep servants working past midnight unless someone is giving the orders. He climbed the steps slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of a habit he had not yet broken, the readiness of a man who had spent too long expecting danger behind every door. The front door was unlocked. That too was wrong. Inside, the hall was warm, the fire in the grate still glowing with fresh coals. A woman's shawl lay draped over the back of a chair that was not there when he left. A pair of small boots, clearly not his own, sat neatly by the stairs. He stood very still, listening to the house breathe around him, and for the first time since stepping off the ship that carried him home, Alexander felt like a stranger in his own life. He climbed the staircase 2 steps at a time, driven by something between curiosity and dread. The door to his mother's old chamber stood slightly open, lamplight spilling out into the hallway. His mother had been gone for 3 years. No one used that room. No one was permitted to use that room. He pushed the door open. A young woman lay asleep in the bed, her dark hair loose across the pillow, a book fallen open on the coverlet beside her hand. She looked peaceful, entirely undisturbed, as though she belonged there, as though the room had always been hers. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. A stranger, sleeping in his mother's bed, in his house, as if she owned it. The floorboard beneath his boot creaked. Her eyes opened at once. She sat up fast, clutching the blanket to her chest, her breath catching in fear before recognition even had the chance to form. For a moment neither of them spoke. She stared at him as though she were looking at a ghost, and in a way, to her, he was one. "You," she whispered, "you are supposed to be dead." Alexander felt the words land like a blow. "I am very much alive," he said, his voice low and controlled, though his heart was pounding. "Perhaps you would like to explain why you are sleeping in my mother's room." The woman scrambled out of bed, pulling a robe around her shoulders, her cheeks flushed with alarm rather than embarrassment. "I am Eleanor Ashby," she said quickly. "Your cousin, through your mother's side. I was told the house needed a steady hand while you were away, and that you were not expected to return." "Not expected," Alexander repeated slowly. "By whom?" Eleanor hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alexander understood that something was very wrong. "By your brother," she said finally. "By Lord Percival. He told me you were killed in battle over a year ago. He told me the estate had no one left to manage it, and that as your closest living relation, I had a duty to help hold things together until matters could be settled properly." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. His brother had told this woman he was dead. His brother had placed a stranger inside his family home, in his mother's private chambers, and had apparently done so with such confidence that the entire household had accepted it without question. "Percival told you I was dead," Alexander said again, testing the words, as though saying them aloud might make sense of them. "And you believed him." "Why would I not believe him?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier now, though her eyes remained wary. "He showed the staff letters, official notices. He wore mourning black for a full month. The whole household grieved you, my lord. I grieved a man I never met, because I was told it was the right thing to do." Alexander turned from her and walked to the window, staring out at the dark gardens below, trying to steady the anger rising in his chest. Percival had always resented standing second in line. As boys, Alexander had assumed it was simple sibling rivalry, the kind that fades with age and responsibility. He had not imagined it might grow into something capable of this. "Where is my brother now?" he asked, without turning around. "In the East Wing," Eleanor said. "He has been managing the estate's affairs from your father's old study. He said it was easier that way, since he understood the accounts better than the staff did. Alexander's jaw tightened. The East Wing held not only his father's study but the estate ledgers, the family seal, and the locked chest containing the documents of succession. If Percival had been alone in that room for over a year, there was no telling what he might have altered, forged, or quietly rewritten in his brother's absence. "I want the staff gathered in the morning," Alexander said, "all of them. And I want to see the ledgers myself, tonight, before anyone has the chance to touch them again." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from fear to something closer to consideration. "You truly did not sign anything before you left," she said slowly, more to herself than to him. "He told us you signed papers granting him temporary authority in case anything happened to you. He said it was your idea." "I signed nothing of the sort," Alexander said. "I left for war with my affairs exactly as they had always been. I trusted my brother to keep them that way." Eleanor's face paled slightly, the realization settling over her in a way that made Alexander believe, for the first time since arriving, that she was not a willing part of whatever scheme his brother had built. She had been placed here, just as he had been reported dead, as a convenient piece in a plan that predated his return by many months. "I did not know," she said quietly. "I swear to you, my lord, I did not know." Alexander studied her face in the lamplight, searching for deception and finding none that he could name. Whatever role she had been given in his brother's arrangement, her shock seemed genuine, her fear real. He had spent 18 months learning to read men's faces on a battlefield, learning which ones told the truth and which ones told comfortable lies to survive another day. Eleanor Ashby did not have the look of a liar. She had the look of someone who had just discovered the ground beneath her feet was not as solid as she believed. "Get dressed," Alexander said finally. "You will help me understand exactly what has happened in this house while I was away, starting from the beginning. Every letter, every visitor, every decision my brother has made. I need to know all of it before the sun rises." Eleanor nodded, some of the fear in her expression giving way to something firmer, something closer to resolve. "There is more you should know," she said. "Things about the tenants, about money that seems to disappear from the accounts. I noticed it weeks ago, but I had no one to tell. Everyone here answers to your brother." Alexander felt a cold certainty settle over him, the same instinct that had once told him when an ambush was waiting just beyond the tree line. Whatever Percival had built in his absence was larger than a simple lie about his death. It was a structure, carefully maintained, and structures like that were rarely built by one man alone. "Then we begin tonight," Alexander said, "before he wakes and realizes his dead brother has come home." Eleanor reached for her boots, her hands trembling slightly, though her voice remained steady. "He will not be pleased," she said. "No," Alexander agreed, a hard edge entering his voice for the first time since he had stepped through his own front door. "He will not be pleased at all." They left the room together, descending the staircase into the quiet house, past the fire still burning in the hall, past the shawl and the small boots that did not belong to anyone Alexander had expected to find inside his home. Somewhere above them, behind a closed door in the East Wing, his brother slept undisturbed, believing his lie had held for another day. Alexander intended to make certain it would not hold for very much longer. At the bottom of the stairs, Eleanor paused and looked back at him, her expression caught somewhere between fear and something that might have been hope. "What will you do," she asked, "when you see him?" Alexander did not answer right away. He looked toward the East Wing, toward the closed door and the man who had buried him in name if not in truth, and felt 18 months of war settle into something colder and more patient than rage. "I will ask him," Alexander said quietly, "why he thought I would never come home to find out." They walked together toward the study, the candle in Eleanor's hand casting long shadows against the walls, and somewhere in the house a clock struck the hour, marking the moment Alexander Whitmore's quiet return had ended, and the fight for his home had truly begun. The study smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, a scent Alexander remembered from childhood, though the room itself felt different now, rearranged in small ways that told him someone had made it their own. The desk that had once belonged to his father sat at a slightly different angle. New locks had been fitted to the drawers. A stack of correspondence sat neatly tied with ribbon, addressed to men whose names Alexander did not recognize. He lit 2 more lamps and began searching through the desk while Eleanor stood watch near the door, listening for footsteps in the corridor above. The first drawer held nothing unusual: household accounts, letters from tenants requesting repairs, the ordinary business of running an estate. The second drawer was locked, and Alexander used the small knife from his boot to force it open, a habit learned in places where locked doors often hid things men did not want found. Inside he found a bundle of documents bound with twine, and near the top a single sheet bearing his own signature, granting Percival full authority over the estate in the event of his death or prolonged absence. Alexander stared at the signature for a long moment. It was close enough to fool a casual glance, but he knew his own hand, and this was not it. The loop of the A curved the wrong way. The final flourish beneath his name was too neat, too practiced, the mark of someone who had studied his signature rather than someone who had simply written it. "This is not mine," he said quietly, holding the paper toward Eleanor. She crossed the room and studied it, her brow furrowing. "It was shown to the solicitor in the village," she said. "I remember, because your brother asked me to witness the reading of it. I signed beneath it as a witness, believing it to be genuine." "Then your name is on a forged document," Alexander said, watching her face carefully. "Which means whoever forged this expected witnesses who would never question it." Eleanor's hands tightened at her sides. "I would not have signed it if I had known," she said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again, mindful of the sleeping house around them. "You must believe that, my lord. I have no reason to protect a lie that has trapped me as much as it has wronged you." Alexander set the paper down and studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, and something in her steadiness reminded him of soldiers he had trusted in the field, men whose honesty showed not in grand declarations, but in the simple refusal to look away. "I believe you," he said finally, "but belief is not proof, and I intend to have proof before the sun rises." They continued through the desk together, and Eleanor proved useful in ways Alexander had not expected. She knew the estate's daily workings far better than he did after so long away, and she pointed out entries in the account books that struck her as strange, sums of money marked as paid to tenants who, as far as she knew, had received no such payments. "Look here," she said, tracing her finger down a column of figures. "This entry says £40 was paid to the Coombe family for repairs to their roof last winter. I visited the Coombe farm myself in the spring. Their roof still leaks. They told me they had asked for help and been refused." Alexander leaned over the ledger, following the same column with narrowed eyes. The handwriting was careful, deliberately neat, the kind of penmanship meant to discourage close inspection. "Someone has been recording payments that were never made," he said, "which means the money went somewhere else. Or stayed with whoever wrote the entry," Eleanor said quietly. They worked through the night, candle wax pooling on the desk, the fire in the small hearth burning low and then lower still. By the time gray light began creeping through the curtains, they had found a dozen similar entries, small sums here and there, easy to overlook individually, but substantial when added together. Someone had been quietly draining the estate's funds for over a year, disguising the theft as ordinary charity toward tenants who had never seen a single coin of it. Alexander sat back in his father's chair, rubbing his eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with the anger that had carried him through the night. "This alone would ruin a man's reputation," he said. "But it is not enough to explain why he told the entire household I was dead. Theft does not require a funeral." Eleanor sat across from him, wrapped in a shawl against the early morning chill, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps the funeral was never about the money," she said slowly. "Perhaps it was about the title. As long as you were presumed dead, your brother held full authority. The moment you returned, that authority would end. Maybe he needed more time to make the theft look permanent, to make his position here look unquestionable, before anyone came looking too closely." Alexander considered this, and the more he turned it over, the more sense it made. Percival had never wanted to wait his turn. As boys, he had always resented being born second, always measured himself against an older brother he could never quite surpass. A staged death would buy him time to consolidate control, time to make himself so thoroughly embedded in the estate's operations that reversing the arrangement would become difficult even after the truth came out. "He did not expect me to survive the war," Alexander said quietly. "And when the reports came that I was missing, he saw an opportunity rather than a tragedy." "I am sorry," Eleanor said, and the sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. "I know these words mean little, given everything you have discovered tonight, but I am sorry that grief was used as a weapon against you, and that I played a part in it, however unknowingly." Alexander studied her in the pale morning light, noting the exhaustion in her eyes, the same exhaustion he felt in his own bones, and found himself believing, with more certainty than he expected, that she had been as much a victim of his brother's design as he had been. "You did not choose this," he said. "You were placed here to make his story believable. A grieving cousin, keeping the house in order, adds weight to a lie that might otherwise seem too convenient. He used you the same way he used a forged signature, as a tool to make his version of events appear solid. Eleanor flinched slightly at the word tool, though she did not argue the truth of it. Then we must undo what he has built, she said instead, straightening in her chair, something firm settling into her posture, before he wakes and realizes the story he told has already begun to fall apart. Alexander gathered the forged document and the ledgers with the suspicious entries, placing them carefully inside a leather satchel he found in the corner of the study. We will need more than these papers, he said. A forged signature and some missing coin will raise questions, but Percival is clever enough to claim ignorance, to blame a dishonest steward, to weep and swear he knew nothing. We need something that ties the forgery directly to him. The solicitor who witnessed the false reading, Eleanor said immediately. If he can be made to admit the truth, that alone would be difficult for your brother to explain away. Alexander nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in his exhausted mind. Then we will need to speak with him ourselves, away from this house, away from anyone who might warn Percival, before we are ready to confront him. Footsteps sounded faintly in the corridor above, slow and unhurried, the sound of someone waking to begin an ordinary day, unaware that the man he had declared dead was sitting in his study with proof of a lie spread across the desk before him. Eleanor's eyes widened, and she reached instinctively for the satchel, tucking it beneath the desk out of sight. "That will be your brother," she whispered. "He rises early, before the rest of the household." Alexander stood, straightening his coat, forcing the exhaustion from his face and replacing it with the calm, unreadable expression he had worn through countless dangerous moments during the war. "Then let him come," he said quietly. "Let him walk into this room and discover that the man he buried has returned to ask him some very difficult questions." Eleanor rose as well, standing beside him rather than behind him, a small gesture that told Alexander she had already chosen a side in whatever conflict was about to unfold. The footsteps grew louder, approaching the study door, and for a moment the entire house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the confrontation neither man could avoid any longer. The door handle turned. Alexander watched it with the same stillness he had once reserved for enemy lines, every muscle prepared, every thought sharpened to a single point. Whatever Percival believed he would find behind that door, it was not his brother, alive, awake, and no longer willing to remain quietly buried beneath a lie built to steal everything that rightfully belonged to him. The door swung open, and for the first time in 18 months, the two brothers stood face to face. Percival stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still on the handle, his face draining of color as though he were looking at something that could not possibly exist. For a long moment, neither brother spoke. The silence stretched thin between them, filled only with the crackle of the dying fire and the distant sound of the household beginning to stir. "Alexander," Percival finally said, his voice cracking on the name. "You are alive." "Very much so," Alexander replied evenly, though his eyes never left his brother's face. "Though I understand you told a rather different story to everyone in this house." Percival stepped into the room slowly, his composure returning by degrees, though Alexander noted the way his brother's gaze flicked briefly to the desk, to the satchel Eleanor had tucked out of sight only moments before. "We received word," Percival said carefully. "Official reports that you had been killed at the front. I mourned you, Alexander. The entire household mourned you. And yet you managed to secure full authority over the estate rather quickly, for a man in mourning," Alexander said, his tone still calm, though a hard edge had crept beneath the surface. "Authority granted, it seems, by a signature I do not recall giving." Percival's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I do not know what you mean. You signed those papers yourself, before you left for the front. You said it was only sensible, given the dangers ahead." "I signed nothing," Alexander said, taking a single step closer, "and I think you know that better than anyone in this house." For a moment, something flickered behind Percival's eyes, a calculation, a search for the safest path forward. Alexander had seen that same look on the faces of men caught in lies during the war, the brief flash of panic before the mind settled on which version of events might still be salvaged. "You are exhausted from your journey," Percival said finally, his voice softening into something almost gentle, almost convincing. "Perhaps we should discuss this later, once you have rested and eaten. These are serious accusations to make on the very night of your return." "I have rested enough to read a ledger," Alexander said, gesturing toward the desk, "and what I have found troubles me far more than exhaustion ever could." Eleanor remained silent beside him, watching the exchange with careful eyes, and Alexander noticed the way Percival's gaze shifted briefly toward her, something calculating in the look, as though he were reassessing whether she might have already told his brother more than he wished her to know. "Eleanor has been managing the household admirably in your absence," Percival said, his tone shifting again, attempting warmth. "I am certain whatever confusion you believe you have found can be easily explained." "Then explain it," Alexander said simply. Percival hesitated, and in that hesitation, the silence of the room grew heavier, more damning than any accusation Alexander could have spoken aloud. Finally, Percival straightened his shoulders and reached for the calm authority that had clearly served him well over the past year and a half. "The estate has faced difficulties," he said. "Debts left unpaid by our father's final years. Tenants requiring assistance beyond what the accounts could easily provide. I did what I believed necessary to keep this house standing while you were gone. If mistakes were made in the record-keeping, I take full responsibility, but I assure you, brother, nothing was done with any intention to deceive you." Alexander studied him for a long moment, weighing the words against everything he and Eleanor had uncovered through the night. The explanation was smooth, reasonable enough to satisfy someone unwilling to look too closely, but it did nothing to address the forged signature, nothing to explain why an entire household had been told he was dead, rather than simply missing. "A signature is not a mistake in record-keeping," Alexander said quietly. "It is a deliberate act, and a funeral held for a man who was never confirmed dead is not caution, Percival, it is opportunity." Percival's composure cracked slightly at the word opportunity, a flash of something colder passing behind his eyes before he mastered it once more. "You have no proof of anything beyond your own suspicion," he said, his voice hardening now, the warmth draining away as quickly as it had appeared. "I would be careful, brother, about accusations you cannot support. This house has grown used to my leadership. The tenants trust me. The staff answer to me. Even the local solicitor has come to rely on my judgment in matters concerning this estate." "Then the solicitor will not mind confirming the details of that signature," Alexander said evenly, "since you seem so confident it is genuine." Something shifted in Percival's expression, quick and subtle, but Alexander caught it, the same flicker of doubt he had seen moments before. Whatever confidence his brother projected, it did not extend to the idea of the solicitor being questioned directly. "That will not be necessary," Percival said quickly. "I am certain we can resolve this between ourselves, as brothers, without dragging outside parties into a private family matter." "It stopped being private the moment you told the world I was dead," Alexander said. "And it stopped being simple the moment tenants who were promised help received nothing, while money meant for them disappeared into accounts I have yet to trace." Percival's face went pale again, and this time the color did not return so easily. He glanced once more toward Eleanor, and this time the look held something sharper, something closer to warning than curiosity. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, though Alexander noticed her hands tighten slightly at her sides. "I think," Percival said slowly, "that you have been listening to rumors spread by people who do not understand how difficult it has been to manage this estate alone. Eleanor is kind, but she is not familiar with the complexities of running a household of this size. I would not put too much weight on her observations." "I trust her observations a great deal," Alexander said. "Far more than I trust an explanation that changes each time I ask a new question." The two brothers stared at each other across the study, the years of quiet resentment and unspoken rivalry finally rising to the surface after being buried for so long beneath the ordinary rhythms of family life. Alexander thought of the letters Percival used to write during their childhood, always slightly bitter beneath their politeness, always measuring his own accomplishments against his older brothers, in ways that seemed harmless at the time but now, in hindsight, seemed like the early roots of something far more dangerous. "I will visit the solicitor myself," Alexander said finally, breaking the tense silence. "Today, before this house has the chance to settle back into whatever story you have been telling it. And I will take Eleanor with me, since her memory of events seems considerably more reliable than yours." Percival's expression hardened, the last traces of warmth disappearing entirely. "You would trust a woman you met only hours ago over your own brother," he said, bitterness creeping into his voice now, unmistakable and raw. "I would trust proof over convenient explanations," Alexander replied. "And so far, brother, you have offered me nothing but the latter." He moved past Percival toward the door, gesturing for Eleanor to follow, and though his brother made no move to stop them, Alexander felt the weight of his gaze following them out of the study, sharp and calculating, already searching for whatever move might come next in a game Alexander had not realized he was playing until the moment he stepped back through his own front door. They rode toward the village in near silence, the early morning mist still clinging to the fields on either side of the road. Eleanor sat across from Alexander in the small carriage, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression distant, clearly turning over everything that had happened since the previous night. He looked at me strangely, she said finally, breaking the silence. When you mentioned trusting my memory over his explanations, it was not anger in his eyes, it was something closer to fear. Alexander considered this carefully. Fear of what, do you think? Fear that I know more than I have said, Eleanor replied. Which worries me, because I am not entirely certain what more there is to know. Alexander studied her profile in the pale morning light, the furrow of concentration between her brows, the careful way she chose her words even now, exhausted and unsettled by everything the night had revealed. You have been more helpful to me in a single night than most men I served beside for months, he said quietly. I want you to know that, whatever comes of this. Eleanor turned to look at him, something softening in her expression despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. I did not expect kindness from you, she admitted. When you first appeared in that doorway last night, I believed I was looking at a man returned from the grave to reclaim a house that no longer wanted him. And now? Alexander asked. Now I believe you are a man trying to reclaim a home that was stolen from him while everyone around him mourned a lie, Eleanor said. Which is a very different thing entirely. The carriage rolled on toward the village, past fields where tenant families were already beginning their morning work, past the small chapel where Alexander's own funeral had presumably been held without his knowledge or consent. He watched the familiar landscape pass by the window, feeling the strange weight of having died once already in the eyes of everyone he had ever known, and wondered how many more surprises waited for him before the truth of his brother's scheme was fully uncovered. Beside him, Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. Whatever the solicitor tells us today, she said, I do not believe this ends simply with a corrected signature and an apology. Your brother has built something over the past year and a half, something with roots deeper than a single forged document. I fear we have only found the smallest part of it so far. Alexander nodded slowly, watching the village come into view ahead, the solicitor's small office nestled between the bakery and the church where he had once been christened as an infant, long before any of this had become necessary. Then we will find the rest of it, he said, however deep it runs. The solicitor's office smelled of ink and old leather, shelves crowded with bound ledgers reaching from floor to ceiling. Mr. Grantham, a thin man with spectacles perched low on his nose, looked up from his desk with polite curiosity that quickly shifted into visible alarm the moment he recognized the man standing in his doorway. Your Grace, he stammered, rising so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. We were told, that is, the entire village believed, that I was dead. Alexander finished for him, stepping into the small office with Eleanor close behind. Yes, I am aware of the story that has been circulating. I would like to discuss the document that made my brother's authority over my estate possible. Grantham's face paled, his eyes darting briefly toward Eleanor before returning to Alexander. I do not know what you mean, Your Grace. I simply processed the paperwork brought to me, as is my duty. The signature on that paperwork was forged, Alexander said, keeping his voice level despite the anger simmering beneath it. I did not write it, and I suspect you knew that when you accepted it. The solicitor's hands began to tremble slightly as he reached for the back of his chair, steadying himself. Your Grace, I assure you, I had no reason to question the document. Lord Percival presented it with full confidence, along with witnesses who confirmed its authenticity. One of those witnesses stands beside me now, Alexander said, gesturing toward Eleanor, and she confirms she witnessed the reading of a document she now believes to be false. Eleanor stepped forward slightly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. I signed as a witness because I was told the paper was genuine, she said. I had no reason at the time to doubt Lord Percival's word. I would like to understand, Mr. Grantham, whether you had reason to doubt it yourself. Grantham sank back into his chair, removing his spectacles and pressing his fingers against his closed eyes. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence in the small office grew heavy with the weight of a confession neither Alexander nor Eleanor dared to interrupt. I suspected, Grantham finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The signature did not match previous documents I had filed on your behalf, Your Grace. But Lord Percival made it clear that questioning him further would not be wise, given the difficulties his family had already endured with the report of your death. He suggested that pursuing the matter would only cause further pain to a grieving household, and offered a sum of money to ensure my continued discretion. He paid you, Alexander said, the words landing heavy in the small room. Yes, Grantham admitted, shame coloring his cheeks. I am not proud of the decision, Your Grace. I told myself it was a small matter, a formality that hardly mattered given the circumstances. I did not fully understand the extent of what I was helping to conceal. Eleanor's expression hardened, though her voice remained controlled. What else did you conceal, Mr. Grantham? A single forged signature does not explain missing funds meant for tenant repairs or accounts that do not add correctly. The solicitor's eyes widened slightly, and Alexander noticed the way his hands tightened against the edge of his desk. There is a second account, Grantham said slowly, as though the words were being pulled from him against his will. Opened shortly after news of your death reached the estate. Funds have been transferred there regularly, though I was never told the full purpose. Lord Percival simply instructed me to process the transfers and ask no questions. Whose name is on that account? Alexander asked, his patience thinning with every new revelation. Grantham hesitated, glancing again toward the door, as though fearing someone might overhear. It is not solely in Lord Percival's name, he said finally. There is another party involved, a woman named Charlotte Vane. I understood her to be a distant relation, though I was never given the full details of the connection. Alexander felt a cold unease settle over him at the unfamiliar name. He had never heard of anyone by that name in connection with his family, and the fact that his brother had involved an outside party in whatever scheme he had constructed only deepened the sense that this went far beyond simple greed or impatience for a title. Where can this woman be found? Alexander asked. She keeps a residence on the far side of the village, Grantham said. Though I understand she does not receive many visitors. Lord Percival visits her regularly, always alone, always in the evenings. Eleanor and Alexander exchanged a glance, both clearly turning over the same unsettling possibilities. A hidden account, a secretive relationship, funds diverted quietly over the course of more than a year, all of it woven around the convenient timing of a death that had never actually occurred. I need you to write down everything you have just told us, Alexander said to Grantham. Every detail, every transfer, every instruction my brother gave you. I understand the position this places you in, but I promise you, the position you find yourself in now is considerably better than the one you will face if this comes to light without your cooperation. Grantham nodded quickly, reaching for a fresh sheet of paper with hands that still trembled slightly. I will write everything I remember, Your Grace. I only ask that you consider the pressure I was under. I have a family of my own to protect, and Lord Percival made it clear that refusing his instructions would not go well for my practice in this village. I understand pressure, Alexander said, his voice softening slightly. I have spent the last 18 months surrounded by nothing else. But understanding does not erase responsibility, Mr. Grantham. Write down the truth, and we will see what can be done to protect you when the rest of this comes to light. While Grantham began writing, Eleanor stepped closer to Alexander, lowering her voice so only he could hear. Charlotte Vane, she said quietly. The name means nothing to me, but something about the way he described her unsettles me. A relation no one has heard of, appearing conveniently around the same time as your reported death. I intend to find out exactly who she is, Alexander said. Before this day ends. They left Grantham's office an hour later, with a written account of the forged signature and the hidden transfers, along with directions to the residence where Charlotte Vane apparently lived in careful seclusion. The village had begun to wake fully around them now, shopkeepers opening their doors, children running along the cobbled streets, all of it achingly ordinary against the backdrop of everything Alexander had discovered since returning home. We should be careful, Eleanor said as they walked toward the carriage. If this woman is connected to your brother's scheme, she may already know we are asking questions. Word travels quickly in a village this size. Alexander nodded, scanning the street around them with the same wary attention he had once reserved for unfamiliar terrain during the war. Then we will not announce ourselves as enemies, he said. We will approach carefully, and listen more than we speak, until we understand exactly what role she plays in all of this. They rode toward the edge of the village in silence, the small residence coming into view at the end of a quiet lane lined with hedgerows, modest but well-maintained, the kind of home that suggested someone comfortable but not wealthy, someone perhaps recently provided for by funds that did not entirely belong to her. As the carriage slowed to a stop, Eleanor turned to Alexander with a question that had clearly been building since they left the solicitor's office. If this woman is connected to your brother in the way I suspect, she said carefully, what will you do? Alexander studied the quiet house ahead, the curtains drawn despite the late morning hour, and felt the same cold patience settle over him that had carried him through the darkest days of the war. I will ask her the same question I asked my brother, he said, and this time, I intend to receive an honest answer. They stepped down from the carriage together, approaching the modest front door with careful steps, neither of them certain what waited on the other side. Only that whatever truth Charlotte Vane held would likely change the shape of everything Alexander believed he understood about his brother's betrayal. The door opened before Alexander's knuckles had finished knocking. as though someone inside had been watching their approach through the curtains. Charlotte Vane stood in the doorway, a slender woman with sharp eyes and a composed expression that betrayed nothing of surprise, only careful calculation. "Your Grace," she said, her voice smooth and unbothered, "I wondered how long it would take you to find your way here." "Then you already know why we have come," Alexander said, studying her closely. "I imagine you have questions about your brother," Charlotte replied, stepping aside to allow them entry, her tone remaining perfectly composed. "I have been expecting this conversation since the moment word reached me that you had returned alive." The inside of the house was modest but carefully furnished, nothing extravagant, though Alexander noticed small details that suggested comfort beyond what an ordinary widow or distant relation might otherwise afford. Fresh flowers sat in a vase near the window. A fire burned steadily in a well-stocked hearth despite the mild weather outside. "Please sit," Charlotte said, gesturing toward a small sitting area. "I find conversations of this nature go more smoothly when no one is standing over the other like a judge." Alexander remained standing regardless, his patience already thin from the morning's revelations. "I am told you share an account with my brother," he said. "One that has received transfers of estate funds regularly since I was reported dead. I would like to understand why." Charlotte's composure flickered only slightly, though she recovered quickly, folding her hands neatly in her lap as she finally took a seat herself. "Your brother and I have known each other for some years," she said carefully. "Long before your unfortunate absence, Your Grace. Our arrangement predates the events you are investigating." "What sort of arrangement?" Eleanor asked, speaking for the first time since entering the house, her voice cutting through the careful evasiveness Charlotte seemed determined to maintain. Charlotte's eyes shifted toward Eleanor, assessing her with new interest. "You must be the cousin," she said. "Percival mentioned you, though he did not describe you quite so directly as you present yourself now." "Answer the question," Alexander said, his patience finally breaking through the calm he had maintained throughout the morning. Charlotte sighed, the composed mask slipping slightly to reveal something wearier beneath it. "Your father and my mother were close," she said, "closer than propriety allowed, though nothing came of it publicly during his lifetime. I am your father's daughter, Your Grace, born outside of marriage and kept quietly hidden from the family that might otherwise have acknowledged me." The words landed in the small room like a physical blow, and Alexander felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood about his family. "You are claiming to be my sister," he said slowly. "I am not claiming it," Charlotte replied. "I am telling you the truth, whether or not you choose to believe it. Your brother discovered the connection some years ago, quite by accident, while going through your father's private papers after his death. He came to me not out of kindness, Your Grace, but out of opportunity. He offered to provide for me quietly, in exchange for my silence regarding my parentage, and later, in exchange for my cooperation once he began planning how to secure control of the estate during your absence at war." Eleanor's face had gone pale, and Alexander felt a similar cold settling over his own chest as the full shape of his brother's scheme finally became clear. Percival had not simply seized an opportunity when reports of Alexander's death arrived. He had been preparing for years, quietly building relationships and resources long before the war ever offered him the convenient excuse he needed. "He told me you would never return," Charlotte said quietly, something almost like regret entering her voice for the first time. "He said the reports from the front were certain, that continuing to fund my silence was simply a practical matter until the estate could be fully secured under his name. I did not ask too many questions, Your Grace, because the money allowed me a life I had never been given the chance to have otherwise." "And now?" Alexander asked. "Now that you know I am alive, and that everything he told you was a lie built to secure a title that was never his to take?" Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting slightly in her lap. "Now I must decide whether my loyalty lies with a man who used my existence as a tool for his own ambition, or with the truth I have kept hidden for far too long," she said finally. "I would prefer the truth," Alexander said. "Written, signed, and given freely, before my brother has the chance to silence you, the way he silenced Mr. Grantham." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, something calculating returning briefly to her expression before it softened into something closer to resolve. "Give me until this evening," she said. "I will have a written account prepared, detailing everything I know of his plans, including the forged signature and the arrangement regarding the estate funds. But I ask for your protection in return, Your Grace. If Percival learns I have spoken against him before your position is secure, I do not believe my safety, or my continued silence about my parentage, will remain in my own hands." Alexander nodded slowly, recognizing the fear beneath her careful composure, a fear he understood well enough after the events of the previous night. "You will have my protection," he said. "Send word when the account is ready, and I will come for it myself." They left the house a short while later, walking back toward the waiting carriage in heavy silence, the weight of Charlotte's revelation settling over both of them differently. Eleanor finally spoke as they climbed inside, her voice quiet with disbelief. "A sister," she said. "Hidden for years, and used as a pawn in whatever your brother has been building. I do not know how much more this family can bear discovering in a single day." Alexander said nothing for a long moment, staring out the window at the passing countryside, his mind turning over the implications of everything they had learned. Percival had not simply acted out of impatience or greed. He had spent years preparing, gathering secrets and resources, waiting for the perfect moment to seize what he believed should have been his all along. "He has had years to plan this," Alexander finally said. "Which means he will not surrender easily, now that he knows I have returned to challenge everything he has built." The carriage had barely turned back toward the estate when a rider approached quickly from the opposite direction, waving them down with visible urgency. Alexander recognized the young man as one of the estate's stable hands, his face flushed with the effort of hard riding. "Your Grace," the young man gasped, pulling his horse alongside the carriage. "You must return at once. Lord Percival has called for the estate's solicitors and the local magistrate. He says he intends to have you declared unfit to hold the title, citing wounds and confusion from the war. He is gathering the household for a formal reading this very afternoon." Alexander felt a fresh wave of fury rising in his chest, quickly suppressed in favor of the cold calculation the situation demanded. Percival was moving faster than expected, clearly aware that time was no longer on his side, attempting to finalize his claim before Alexander could gather enough proof to stop him. "How long until the reading begins?" Alexander asked. "Within the hour, Your Grace," the stable hand replied. "The household is already gathering in the main hall." Eleanor's expression had hardened with determination, any lingering exhaustion from the previous night replaced entirely by the urgency of the moment. "We will not make it back in time if we travel at a normal pace," she said. "Then we will not travel at a normal pace," Alexander said, calling up to the driver to push the horses as fast as the road would safely allow. As the carriage lurched forward, gaining speed along the country road, Eleanor reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his, a gesture that seemed to surprise them both in its simplicity. "Whatever happens in that hall today," she said, "I want you to know that I believe you, Alexander. Not because of the ledgers or the forged signature or anything we have found today. I believe you because of the man standing in front of me now, fighting not for a title, but for the truth." Alexander looked down at her hand resting over his, feeling something shift inside him that had nothing to do with anger or betrayal. Something warmer and more unexpected than anything he had allowed himself to feel since returning from the war. "I came home that night expecting to find nothing worth saving," he admitted quietly. "I had spent so long surrounded by loss that I nearly convinced myself there would be nothing left waiting for me. Instead, I found you, asleep in a room that should have been empty. And somehow, in the middle of discovering my own brother's betrayal, I found something I did not expect to feel again." Eleanor's eyes softened, her hand tightening slightly around his. "I did not stay in that house out of duty alone," she admitted. "Not anymore. Somewhere between the ledgers and the solicitor and the long ride to Charlotte Vane's door, I began to care what happened to you, Alexander. More than I ever expected to." The carriage rattled onward, gaining speed with every passing minute, the estate finally coming into view ahead as the afternoon light began to slant golden across the fields. Whatever waited for them in that main hall, whatever final confrontation Percival had arranged in his desperation to secure the title, before the truth caught up with him, Alexander felt steadier facing it now than he had at any point since stepping through his own front door the night before. He was no longer fighting only for the estate, or for the title that was rightfully his. He was fighting for the woman seated beside him, whose quiet courage had helped him uncover the truth in a single night, and whose hand now rested in his as though it belonged there. The carriage rolled through the estate gates just as the first church bells in the distance began to ring the hour, and Alexander steadied himself for whatever waited beyond the doors of his own home. The main hall was already full when Alexander and Eleanor arrived, the household staff lined along the walls, the local magistrate seated near the great fireplace beside a solicitor Alexander did not recognize, and Percival standing at the head of the room, dressed with careful formality, every inch the picture of a man confident in his authority. His expression faltered only slightly when the doors opened and Alexander strode inside, but he recovered quickly, straightening his shoulders and addressing the room as though nothing had changed. "Ah," Percival said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "My brother has decided to join us. I was just explaining to the magistrate that recent events have raised concerns about your fitness to resume full authority over the estate, given the wounds and hardships you endured during the war." Whispers moved through the gathered staff, and Alexander felt their eyes on him, uncertain, torn between loyalty to the master they had mourned and the brother who had guided them through the past year and a half. He understood, in that moment, exactly how carefully Percival had constructed this trap. A formal reading, witnesses gathered, doubt planted before Alexander even had the chance to defend himself. "I appreciate my brother's concern for my well-being," Alexander said, his voice steady and carrying easily through the silent hall. "Though I find it curious that a man so concerned for my fitness would forge my signature on a document granting himself authority over an estate he believed I would never return to claim." Gasps rippled through the room, and Percival's composure cracked visibly for the first time, his eyes darting toward the magistrate before settling back on Alexander with something colder and more desperate than before. "That is a serious accusation to make without proof," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I have proof," Alexander said, stepping forward and setting the leather satchel down on a small table near the center of the hall. He opened it carefully, removing the forged document, the ledgers with their falsified entries, and the written account Grantham had provided that morning. "A confession from the solicitor who witnessed your forgery, detailed records of estate funds diverted into a hidden account, and testimony from a woman you have been paying for her silence since our father's death, long before I ever left for the war." Percival's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with the dawning realization that whatever plan he had rushed to execute that afternoon had already collapsed before it began. "You have no right," he said, his voice rising with desperation now. "This is a family matter, not something to be aired before servants and strangers." "You made it a public matter," Alexander said, "the moment you told this entire household I was dead, and used that lie to seize control of everything our father built." The magistrate, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally rose from his seat, his expression grave as he examined the documents Alexander had laid before him. "These are serious allegations, Your Grace," he said, addressing Alexander directly now. "Forgery, theft of estate funds, and deliberate deception regarding a matter as significant as a death within a noble family. If these documents prove genuine, your brother faces consequences far beyond the loss of any temporary authority he has held." Percival's eyes swept desperately across the room, searching for some ally, some path forward that did not end in complete ruin. His gaze landed briefly on the household staff lining the walls, men and women who had served under his direction for over a year, but he found no support there, only quiet uncertainty giving way slowly to something closer to disappointment as the truth settled over the gathered crowd. "I did what I believed necessary," Percival said finally, his voice breaking slightly, the careful composure he had maintained for so long finally crumbling under the weight of everything laid bare before him. "I have spent my entire life standing in your shadow, Alexander. Second son, second choice, second in everything that ever mattered. When word came that you had died, I finally saw a chance to become something more than an afterthought in our father's legacy. And instead you became a thief and a liar," Alexander said, though something in his voice had softened slightly, the old ache of childhood rivalry surfacing briefly beneath the anger. "I am sorry you never felt you had a place of your own in this family, Percival, but that pain does not excuse what you have done. Tenants went without help they were promised. A woman was hidden away and used as leverage for your own ambitions. And I was declared dead to a household that should have trusted the truth rather than the story you found most convenient." Percival said nothing further, his shoulders slumping as the magistrate stepped forward to address the formal matter of his conduct. The remainder of the confrontation passed in a blur of legal proceedings, the magistrate confirming the authenticity of Grantham's confession and Charlotte's written account, which arrived by messenger just as the hall began to empty, sealing the final proof needed to strip Percival of any remaining claim to the estate's authority. By evening, the household had begun to settle into a strange, uneasy quiet, the truth of the past year and a half finally laid bare before everyone who called the estate home. Percival was escorted from the property under the magistrate's supervision, his future uncertain, though Alexander had made clear he would not seek the harshest possible consequences, mindful of whatever fractured loyalty still remained between brothers despite everything that had happened. Alexander found Eleanor standing alone in the garden as the last light of evening faded into dusk, her expression thoughtful as she looked out over the grounds that had so nearly slipped away from the family who had always called them home. "It is strange," she said as he approached, "how quickly everything can change in a single day. Yesterday you were a stranger, returning to a house that no longer recognized you. Today you are its rightful master once more, and I find myself uncertain what my place here is meant to be, now that the truth has finally come to light." Alexander stopped beside her, studying the quiet garden, the same one he had walked through as a boy long before war or betrayal had ever touched his family. "Your place," he said slowly, "was never something Percival's lies determined, and it is not something that ends simply because the truth has been revealed." Eleanor turned to look at him, her expression uncertain, though something hopeful flickered beneath the surface. "What are you saying, Alexander?" "I am saying that I did not simply reclaim my home tonight," he said, reaching for her hand the way he had in the carriage earlier that day. "I found something inside it worth protecting, worth building toward, in a way I had stopped believing possible after everything the war had taken from me. I am not asking you to stay out of gratitude, or convenience, or any sense of obligation toward the man who returned unannounced and turned your world upside down in a single night." "Then what are you asking?" Eleanor whispered. Alexander knelt slowly in the quiet garden, the last light of evening casting the grounds in soft gold around them, and looked up at the woman who had stood beside him through every difficult discovery of the past day, unwavering in her honesty even when the truth threatened to unravel everything she had known. "I am asking you to stay because I want you here," he said, "not as a duke securing an heir, or a master requiring a steady hand to manage his household, but as a man who has finally found something worth returning home to. Eleanor Ashby, will you stay, and build something new with me, out of everything that was nearly lost?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she made no effort to hide, and for the first time since Alexander had stepped through his own front door and found her sleeping in his mother's room, her answer came without hesitation. "Yes," she said softly, "I will stay." The garden fell quiet around them, the last light fading gently into evening, and for the first time in 18 months, Alexander Whitmore felt the war, the betrayal, and the long, uncertain journey home finally settle into something resembling peace. The weeks following that quiet evening in the garden brought changes to the estate that Alexander had not fully anticipated, though he welcomed each one as proof that the household was finally healing from the long shadow his brother had cast over it. Word of Percival's disgrace had spread quickly through the village, and though Alexander had spared him from the harshest legal consequences, choosing instead to see him exiled from the estate with a modest allowance rather than imprisoned, the damage to the family name would take considerably longer to mend than the ledgers ever had. Eleanor threw herself into repairing what could still be salvaged, beginning with the tenants who had been promised help that never arrived. She visited the Coombe family herself, standing beside Alexander as workers finally repaired the leaking roof that had gone neglected for over a year despite the false entries claiming otherwise. Josiah Coombe, an older man with weathered hands and a cautious nature, watched the repairs with quiet disbelief. "We had given up expecting help," he admitted to Alexander one afternoon, as new timber was fitted carefully into place above the family's modest home. "Lord Percival always had an excuse ready, some delay or difficulty that pushed our repairs further down the list. We assumed it was simply how things were done now that the old duke had passed and the new one was gone to war. That is finished," Alexander told him firmly. "You will find that promises made on this estate are promises kept, from this day forward." Word of such gestures traveled quickly among the tenant families, and slowly, cautiously, trust began rebuilding itself across the estate in ways that no forged document or hollow declaration ever could have achieved. Eleanor proved instrumental in this process, her intimate knowledge of the household's daily struggles allowing her to identify exactly where help was needed most, and her steady presence beside Alexander reassured tenants who had grown wary of promises after so many months of quiet neglect. Charlotte Vane's situation required more delicate handling. Alexander visited her again several weeks after the confrontation in the main hall, this time without the urgency that had marked their first meeting. He found her garden considerably more cheerful than before, fresh flowers blooming along a newly tended path. "I did not expect you to return," she admitted, inviting him inside with far less caution than their first encounter had contained. "I told you that you would have my protection," Alexander said. That promise did not end simply because the truth came to light. They spoke for a long while that afternoon, carefully navigating the strange new territory of a relationship neither of them had expected to discover. Alexander made no grand declarations of immediate acceptance into the family, understanding that trust, much like the tenant repairs, could not be rushed without risking a foundation too fragile to hold. But he offered her continued support, a formal acknowledgement of the connection between them, and the beginning of what might eventually become something resembling family, built slowly, rather than demanded all at once. Your father would have been ashamed of how he handled things, Charlotte said quietly during that visit, but I do not believe he would be ashamed of the man you have become, in cleaning up what was left behind. Alexander considered her words carefully, recognizing in them both an old grief and a cautious hope for something better moving forward. We will find our way through this together, he said, as much as circumstances allow. Back at the estate, Eleanor had begun quietly transforming the household in ways that extended beyond simple financial repair. She reorganized the staff schedules to ensure fair treatment for servants who had been overworked during Percival's mismanagement, and she established a small fund, separate from the estate's general accounts, specifically dedicated to tenant emergencies that might otherwise go unnoticed until they became disasters. Mrs. Abbott, the estate's longtime housekeeper, remarked on the changes one evening as she helped Eleanor review the household ledgers, now kept with scrupulous honesty under joint supervision. It feels different here, the older woman said, glancing around the warmly lit kitchen. Lighter somehow, though I could not tell you exactly why. Perhaps because there are no more secrets weighing down the walls, Eleanor suggested, and Mrs. Abbott nodded slowly in agreement, understanding the truth in those words better than most, having lived through the uneasy year and a half when something had clearly felt wrong within the household without anyone being able to name exactly what. Alexander, for his part, found himself settling into a version of home life he had nearly given up hoping for during his months at war. The nightmares that had followed him back from the front gradually softened, replaced by the steady rhythm of estate management, tenant visits, and quiet evenings spent with Eleanor discussing plans for the future, rather than untangling lies from the past. Their wedding took place in early autumn, a modest affair by noble standards, held in the same small chapel where Alexander had once been falsely mourned. Tenant families filled the pews alongside household staff, a gathering considerably warmer and more genuine than any grand society affair Percival might have arranged during his brief reign over the estate. Charlotte attended as well, seated near the front at Alexander's insistence, a small but meaningful gesture toward the family bond they were still carefully building. As Alexander watched Eleanor walk toward him through the chapel, dressed simply but beautifully, he thought back to that first night, standing frozen in his mother's doorway, staring at a stranger sleeping in a room that should have been empty. He had believed in that moment that he was looking at one more casualty of his brother's scheme, one more piece of proof that everything he had once trusted had been quietly stolen away in his absence. Instead, he had found the one thing capable of making his return home feel like coming back to life, rather than simply surviving it. The reception that followed filled the estate grounds with laughter and warmth that had been notably absent during the long months of Percival's careful, cold management. Tenants mingled freely with household staff, children ran between the tables set up across the lawn, and for the first time since his return from war, Alexander felt the full weight of everything he had fought to reclaim, settle into something that finally resembled peace rather than mere victory. Late in the evening, as the celebration began winding down and lanterns were lit against the gathering darkness, Eleanor found Alexander standing near the same garden where he had first proposed, watching the last guests depart with quiet contentment. "You look troubled," she observed, slipping her hand into his, the way she had grown accustomed to doing over the past months. "Not troubled," Alexander said, glancing down at her with a soft smile. "Simply grateful. I spent so long during the war believing that whatever waited for me at home, if anything waited at all, would never feel like enough after everything I had lost. I did not expect to find something greater than what I left behind." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, watching the last lanterns flicker softly against the darkening sky. "Perhaps that is what makes it meaningful," she said. "We did not simply return to what was lost. We built something new out of the ruins your brother left behind, something neither of us could have found without first surviving everything that nearly destroyed it." They stood together in comfortable silence as the estate settled into evening quiet around them, the house behind them glowing warmly with lamplight, no longer hiding secrets behind its walls, no longer harboring lies dressed up as grief. Alexander thought of the tenants whose trust had slowly been rebuilt, of Charlotte finding her place within a family that had once refused to acknowledge her, of Eleanor herself, who had transformed from a frightened stranger discovered in his mother's bed into the steady partner who had helped him reclaim everything that mattered. The estate would continue to heal in the months and years ahead, its fields tended honestly, its tenants cared for without deception, its ledgers kept clean under the careful eyes of two people who understood better than most the cost of allowing lies to take root unchecked. Percival's shadow would fade slowly, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of a household finally at peace with itself. Alexander Whitmore had returned home without warning, expecting only silence and dust. Instead, he had found betrayal, truth, and finally, standing beside him beneath a darkening evening sky, the woman who had helped him rebuild everything worth saving. And as the last lantern flickered softly against the night, he understood, with a certainty that had eluded him through 18 long months of war, that he had finally, truly come home.